And West Africa is making its strongest push in 2 decades to create a single shared currency.
ECOWAS is back again with their premier white elephant project, the eco currency.
Africa is preparing to launch a single currency that could directly challenge the dominance of the US dollar. And most people have no idea it is happening. The currency is called the ECO, and if everything goes according to plan, it will be used by up to 15 West African nations starting in July 2027, replacing the individual currencies of countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Ivory Coast. This is one of the most ambitious monetary unions ever attempted outside of Europe, and if it succeeds, it will fundamentally change how African countries trade with each other, how they interact with Western economies, and how much power the dollar has over the continent. In mid-February 2026, central bank governors from 12 West African countries gathered in Monrovia, Liberia, for 3 days of intensive meetings to finalize the ECO launch. They discussed macroeconomic convergence criteria, reserve pooling, and capitalization of the proposed Central Bank of West Africa. The December 2025 ECOWAS summit in Abuja had already reaffirmed the July 2027 launch date. According to reports from Monrovia, ECOWAS economies recorded 4.8% growth in 2025, up from 4.3% in 2024, with inflation moderating and fiscal positions improving. 4 countries met all 4 primary convergence criteria in 2025, compared to only 2 in 2024. The numbers are moving in the right direction, but to understand why this matters beyond West Africa, you need to understand what the ECO is actually replacing. For 8 West African nations, the currency they currently use is not truly theirs. It is called the CFA franc, and it has been controlled by France since 1945, back when these countries were still French colonies. The CFA franc was created after World War II, when France devalued the French franc to align with Bretton Woods. But rather than forcing its African colonies to absorb that devaluation, it created a separate currency for them. French officials presented this as generosity, but the reality was calculated. The CFA franc ensured that French colonies would continue trading primarily with France because their currency was pegged to the French franc at a fixed rate, making imports from France cheap and exports elsewhere expensive. When these nations gained independence in the 1960s, they kept the CFA franc, and France kept control. The system works like this. The CFA franc is pegged to the euro at a fixed rate of 655.957 CFA francs to 1 euro. France guarantees unlimited convertibility, providing stability. But in exchange, member countries must deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in a special account at the French Treasury in Paris. Until 2005, that figure was 65%. Before that, it was 100%. Even at 50%, it means half the wealth these countries accumulate from exports, natural resources, and remittances sits in Paris, not in their own central banks where they could use it for development. France also held seats on the boards of the 2 central banks issuing CFA francs, giving it veto power over monetary policy. In 1994, France unilaterally devalued the CFA franc by 50% overnight. African presidents and central bank governors were informed after the decision and told to sign off. They complied. The result was devastating. Hundreds of millions saw their purchasing power collapse as import costs exploded. Economists and activists have called the CFA franc a colonial currency for decades, and the anger has only intensified. In December 2019, under mounting pressure, French President Emmanuel Macron and Ivory Coast President Alassane Ouattara announced reforms. France would withdraw from the governance boards and eliminate the 50% reserve requirement. The currency would be renamed the ECO. It sounded like victory, but there was a catch. The ECO would still be pegged to the euro. The fixed exchange rate, the core mechanism critics say locks these economies into dependency, would remain. Many economists argued that without breaking the peg, the ECO was just a rebranded CFA franc. Then COVID hit. The 2020 launch was postponed. Then 2025 passed. Now it is 2027. And the broader ECOWAS bloc, which includes non-CFA countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and the Gambia, has been pushing for a different version. One not pegged to the euro, one with a flexible exchange rate, and one genuinely independent. That is the version being discussed in Monrovia. And that version, if it launches and functions as intended, could challenge the structural role of Western currencies in African trade and global finance. To understand how, you need to understand what the dollar does globally. The US dollar accounts for 59% of global foreign exchange reserves as of 2024. It is used in 88% of all foreign exchange transactions worldwide. Oil is priced in dollars. Major commodities are traded in dollars. International debt is issued in dollars. Even when two non-US countries trade with each other, they often settle in dollars because it is the most liquid and widely accepted currency on Earth. This gives the United States enormous power. If the US imposes sanctions, it can cut a country off from the global financial system, because that system runs on dollars and is controlled through institutions like SWIFT, dominated by Western countries. African nations understand this intimately. When Russia was sanctioned in 2022, after invading Ukraine, half its central bank reserves, worth hundreds of billions, were frozen. Russian banks were cut off from SWIFT. The message was clear. If you hold reserves in dollars or euros and conduct transactions through Western-controlled systems, you are vulnerable to decisions made in Washington or Brussels that have nothing to do with your interests. This is where the ECO becomes more than regional. If West Africa, a region with over 400 million people and a GDP approaching $800 billion, launches a currency not pegged to the euro or dollar, it creates an alternative. It allows countries within the bloc to trade in their own currency, eliminating the need to convert to dollars for intra-regional commerce. Right now, trade between ECOWAS states accounts for only 15% of their total trade. Most commerce is with external partners, conducted in foreign currencies, primarily dollars, which means transaction costs, exchange rate risks, and dependency on Western financial systems. A successful ECO could dramatically increase intra-regional trade by removing those barriers. If Nigeria buys goods from Ghana, instead of converting naira to dollars, shipping those dollars through international banks, converting to cedis, and paying fees at every step, the transaction happens directly in ECO. Multiply that across 15 countries and hundreds of billions in annual trade, and the scale becomes clear. But the implications go beyond West Africa. If the ECO works, it provides a model for other African blocs. The East African Community has discussed its own single currency for years. The Southern African Development Community has explored monetary integration. If ECOWAS proves a Pan-African currency can function independently, other regions will follow. And if that happens, the dollar dominance in Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people with the fastest growing population and some of the fastest growing economies in the world, starts to erode. This is not hypothetical. It is already happening elsewhere. The BRICS bloc has established currency swap agreements allowing member countries to trade in their own currencies without converting to dollars. They created the new development bank as an alternative to the World Bank and IMF. They are expanding use of China's cross-border interbank payment system as an alternative to SWIFT. Russia and China now conduct significant bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. India has signed agreements to trade with multiple countries using rupees. Saudi Arabia, which for nearly 50 years conducted all oil transactions exclusively in dollars, announced in 2022 it was open to trading in other currencies. The trend is unmistakable. Countries are diversifying away from the dollar. The dollar's share of global reserves has declined from over 70% in the early 2000s to 59% today. In the world of reserve currencies, that is massive. The question is not whether de-dollarization will continue, but how fast it will accelerate and what will replace the dollar. The ECO, if successful, accelerates that process in Africa, not by directly replacing the dollar globally, because that is not realistic, but by creating an ecosystem where African countries can conduct more commerce without needing dollars at all. If Nigeria and Ghana trade now, they convert local currencies to dollars, conduct the transaction, and convert back. Every step involves fees, exchange rate fluctuations, and exposure to Federal Reserve decisions that have nothing to do with African economic conditions. With the ECO, the transaction happens in a shared currency both countries control through the Central Bank of West Africa. No dollars needed, no conversion fees, no exposure to Fed interest rate decisions. Multiply that across 15 countries and extend it beyond ECOWAS. Imagine the ECO becomes a benchmark for intra-African trade. Imagine African countries holding ECO reserves alongside dollar and euro reserves, diversifying holdings like central banks worldwide buying gold. Imagine commodities, particularly oil and gas from Nigeria, being priced in ECO for regional buyers instead of automatically in dollars. This is not about replacing the dollar globally. It is about reducing dependence regionally, which collectively, across multiple regions doing the same, undermines the structural dominance that has made the dollar uniquely powerful, and that worries Washington. In 2023, President Trump threatened 100% tariffs on BRICS countries if they attempt to create a currency to rival the dollar. That threat reveals how seriously the US takes challenges to dollar dominance. If a regional African currency gains traction, expect similar pressure. But there are massive obstacles. The first is convergence criteria. For the ECO to function, members need similar inflation rates, fiscal deficits, and foreign exchange reserves. Right now, they do not. Nigeria, the largest economy, struggles with high inflation and currency volatility. Ghana recently went through a debt crisis. Smaller economies like Liberia and the Gambia have entirely different fiscal realities. The European Union faced similar challenges with the euro, and despite decades of integration and stronger institutional frameworks, the Eurozone still experiences recurring crises. The second obstacle is political will and external resistance. France will not simply walk away from a system that has benefited it for 80 years. CFA franc countries are being offered a choice: stay with the Euro-pegged ECO that France supports, or join the broader ECOWAS ECO that would be independent but riskier. That choice is deeply political. Leaders who built careers within the France-Afrique system face real consequences for breaking away. History provides stark warnings. In 1963, Togo's President Sylvanus Olympio was planning to create an independent currency. He was assassinated by French-trained soldiers days before launch. Multiple African leaders who challenged French monetary control have faced coups, destabilization, or suspicious deaths. The third obstacle is institutional capacity. Building a central bank from scratch, establishing payment systems, printing and distributing currency across 15 countries, training personnel, and coordinating fiscal policies across vastly different economies is extraordinarily complex. The West African Monetary Agency has acknowledged they are behind schedule. They need 78 activities completed by July 2027 just to meet minimum requirements, with 14 extending into 2027 itself. But despite these obstacles, the fact that this conversation is happening represents a fundamental shift. For decades, African monetary independence was dismissed as economically dangerous and technically impossible. African countries were told they needed European currency pegs, Western central banking expertise, and European guarantees. Any attempt to break away was portrayed as reckless nationalism leading to hyperinflation and collapse. Now that narrative is being challenged. The ECO is discussed by central bank governors in official meetings, financed by regional development funds, backed by summit declarations signed by heads of state, and supported by institutions like the African Development Bank. The momentum is real and growing, even as the timeline slips and obstacles remain formidable. And here is what makes this significant. Even if the ECO fails, even if it launches and collapses within years, the attempt itself changes the conversation. It demonstrates that alternatives to dollar and euro dependence can be seriously pursued. It shows what works and what does not. It builds infrastructure, legal frameworks, and trained personnel that persist. And it signals to Western powers that African countries are no longer willing to accept monetary arrangements designed in Paris or Washington without meaningful voice. The ECO will not replace the dollar globally, but it does not have to. It just needs to work well enough to prove that a regional African currency controlled by Africans can function independently, facilitate trade, and serve African economic interests rather than former colonial powers. If it does that, even partially, it becomes a model. The euro started with 6 countries in 1957. Today it is used by 27. The lesson is not that every currency union succeeds, but that successful ones change the architecture of global finance in ways that outlast any single government or crisis. So when you hear that West African Central Bank governors met in Monrovia in February 2026 to finalize the ECO, do not think of it as just another regional policy story. Think of it as part of a larger global realignment happening right now, where the dominance of the dollar, unchallenged since 1945, is being questioned from multiple directions simultaneously. BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems. Gulf states are exploring non-dollar oil pricing. Central banks worldwide are buying gold at record levels. And now, West Africa is preparing to launch a currency designed explicitly to reduce reliance on former colonial monetary systems. Will the ECO launch in July 2027? Maybe. Will it function as intended? Less certain. Will it rival the dollar? Not in the short or medium term, but will it chip away at structures that have kept African economies locked in dependency for generations? Possibly. And that possibility alone is significant, because the story of the 21st century is not just about who holds power, it is about who has the vision and courage to build alternatives when the existing system no longer serves their interests. West Africa is building one. Whether it succeeds, fails, or lands somewhere in between, the attempt itself tells us the world is changing in ways most people are not yet paying attention to.